All Prime Minister need to ensure three key elements are on their side if they want to retain their position of power. They need to have their own MPs and ministers, the public, and journalists on side. While the latter two are often very visible, and it's abundantly clear when they're not on the side of the Prime Minister, it's often more tricky to gauge when their detractors on the backbenches or even in cabinet decide that change is needed. You may be wondering why we've brought this up, and why we started a video by discussing how a Prime Minister loses their job. Well, it's because we've noticed an increase in speculation over the last few weeks and months that the current Prime Minister may be starting to lose the support of his backbenchers over a number of key issues. So in this video, we're going to discuss exactly that, what the Prime Minister has lost support over, and whether this could spell the beginning of the end for his tenure in number 10. If this is a topic you're interested in, you might want to check out the latest episode of our new podcast, Politics Unpacked. In the episode, we discuss, well, frankly argue, whether Dominic Cummings, the PM's former chief advisor, is a master manipulator and political Svengali or an overhyped mess. Given the announcement that he left number 10 yesterday, there's no better time to consider this, because if he's as good as some people like to claim, losing Cummings could be a massive blow for the government. You can watch the full podcast on YouTube or listen in your favourite podcast app. There's links to all of those options down below. So, Johnson's uncomfortable position and potentially rebellious MPs. The first thing to note here is that the Prime Minister has been put in an awkward position by the coronavirus. After all, Johnson is an unlikely candidate to be the Prime Minister to enact the biggest curbs on civil liberties the country has likely ever seen. As the leader of the Conservative Party, which supposedly advocates for the lessening of state intervention in the economy and our social lives, this puts him in an awkward position. Add to that the fact that he's historically been very reluctant to discuss his personal life, regularly refusing to answer questions about his children or romantic partners. Clearly, he's a firm believer in personal liberty, maybe even more than anyone else in the party, and it's a party notable for its support of it. But what does this cognitive dissonance have to do with backbench rebellions? Well, it appears to be a cruel irony that it seems that Johnson would be more naturally aligned with the backbenchers criticising the curbs on liberty that are currently happening. But instead, he's the one leading us into national lockdowns that are deeply and totally controlling all aspects of our economic and social lives. This is what puts him in a difficult position, because his natural allies are the ones he has to face off against. Johnson has publicly been apprehensive about putting the UK back into a national lockdown, but due to rising case numbers, he felt that he was left with no other option. This was despite his hopes for retaining some limited liberties in areas of the UK with low case numbers, under a regional tiered system, something which at least initially didn't seem to work. This whole issue is likely building momentum in the Conservative Party against their leader. There have been many votes on coronavirus restrictions that have already seen backbench rebellions. In fact, the vote on the 10 PM curfew for bars and restaurants had 42 Conservative rebels, despite being a government proposal. This puts Johnson in a tough position, as those that in normal times may back him are now the ones leading the charge against him. You may be wondering that if there have been multiple votes so far on lockdowns and coronavirus restrictions, if the fact that Johnson hasn't seen more of a rebellion so far is actually a good thing. Is that a sign that his natural allies aren't actually that annoyed with him and the restrictions that are being implemented? Well, as this is politics we're talking about, the answer is no. And the reason? Well, political game playing. Frustrated backbenchers are often in a tricky position. Anyone who enters politics does it because they think they might be able to make the world a better place. Either that, or they want a legacy and power. All of these things, though, require high office. Every time a backbencher goes against their government, their chances of gaining this office decrease. So they have to be wary and tactical over when to use their limited number of rebellions before they're blacklisted by the party. So this could be why Johnson hasn't seen a significant number of backbench rebellions so far. While some were willing to use one of their votes against the government on the 10 PM curfew, where Labour also abstained, they were not willing to consistently do this. As one Tory MP told the Financial Times about the vote on the November lockdown, the measures are going to pass, so why rebel? There are only so many people who are willing to vote against the government just to make a point. This is telling though. It signifies that there are a whole bunch of Tory MPs who are growing tired of the curbs on liberty, and while they're not willing to make a statement just yet, this doesn't mean they won't be willing to do so in the future. Another telling sign that this may happen is the formation of the COVID Recovery Group, a group of Tory backbench MPs whose aim is to defeat the government on any votes to extend the lockdown beyond the 2nd of December. Worryingly for Johnson, this group is led by former Chief Whip Mark Harper and prominent lockdown skeptic Steve Baker. About the group, they remarked, "Lockdowns cost lives, whether in undiagnosed cancer treatments, deteriorating mental health, and missed A&E appointments. Not to mention the impact it has on young people's education, job prospects, and our soaring debts. The cure we're prescribing runs the risk of being worse than the disease. The COVID Recovery Group will play its part in helping the government to deliver an enduring strategy for living with the virus, so that we break the transmission of the disease, command public support, end this devastating cycle of repeated restrictions, and start living in a sustainable way until an effective, safe vaccine is successfully rolled out across the population." It's not currently known how many MPs back this and how many are part of the group, but these sorts of groups can do serious damage to prime ministers, especially when their votes are coordinated. Theresa May struggled throughout her entire premiership with the European Research Group, the ERG, who consistently pushed her for a harder form of Brexit. And it was them who led the charge to vote down her Brexit deals when they were presented in Parliament. This undermined her as a Prime Minister, to the point that many of her own MPs thought that her position was untenable and that she had to resign, which of course she did. While it's not clear whether the COVID Recovery Group will or could do the same, they may start to undermine Johnson as Prime Minister, especially if this coincides with public reluctance to further COVID restrictions in 2021. So, while it appears that the Prime Minister may have to do battle with the backbenchers in the near future, he also appears to have a more immediate problem: Dominic Cummings. For those of you who don't follow British politics too closely, Cummings was Johnson's advisor, who also successfully led the Vote Leave campaign. He's one of the Prime Minister's closest allies, and is largely credited for winning Johnson both his position and the general election. It's also been said that Johnson relies on him more than his cabinet members. However, unfortunately for Johnson, it was announced yesterday that Cummings had left Number 10, a huge blow for him, which may leave him unable to deal with the mounting backbench frustrations. So Johnson seems to have lost his most trusted ally, the man who steered Johnson through the choppy waters of the Brexit campaign and leadership contest, all the way through to not only his premiership, but also a resounding electoral victory. Losing such a key ally right now has come at a really inopportune moment for the Prime Minister. With Johnson about to go toe-to-toe with his backbenchers, he would likely fare a lot better with his key advisor at his side. With Cummings out and backbenchers set to revolt, Johnson may be wanting to get his right-hand man back. Without him, Johnson could be doomed. But what do you think? Will Johnson battle the backbenchers, and does he need Cummings to do so? Just a quick reminder though about that Cummings podcast. I know I've already plugged it, but honestly mate, you've made it this far into the video, you're going to like the episode and Politics Unpacked more generally. And given yesterday's announcement, there's no better time to consider how influential and brilliant Cummings actually was, because that likely dictates how much of a success Johnson will be going forward without him. Actually, if you're really into these parliamentary shenanigans, you probably also like This Week in Parliament, our weekly summary of what's happened in Westminster. The latest episode will be out on the TLDR Daily channel tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe over there to be notified when it's released. The podcast and This Week in Parliament are both linked down below. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible, and if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.